Thank you very much. I'm very indebted to Suparna, and I would do anything that she asked me to. If she asked me to, if she asked me to dance naked in the parking lot, I would do it, although it would probably be counterproductive from the point of view of. But I am curious as to why Kartig is keenly observing the girls at Muhlenberg, but maybe that's another conversation. I'm very, very happy that Suparna and her team, who run a world-class operation, finally have a world-class facility to do it in. This place is really impressive. So Suparna is perhaps not an impartial judge of my speaking ability, because the only speaking I've really done to Suparna has been from a position of being face down on a table. But I'll do my best here. So I mentioned Suparna and Dr. Bob Wilson, who's not here, in the acknowledgments of my book, because when I was writing this book several years ago, my back went out, and I was in excruciating pain. And after a couple of days, I was able to come in and see Suparna, and she started making it better and better and better. It took a few months before I could really walk without pain again. But it was an interesting vantage point from which to think about interaction of body and mind, which is the central problem of the book. Here I am trying to think very elevated philosophical thoughts about what it is to be conscious, what it is to be a person, what it is to be fundamentally composed of molecules and their atoms and their particles, yet to have a soul, to somehow exceed the material basis of what we are, and to do all of that while having this excruciating pain that kept dragging me down to a really acute consciousness of what we also are, fully embodied beings. So I'll tell you a couple of things about what generated this book and what the book is about, and then I'll get into a couple of the issues of it. A few years ago, I was asked if I wanted to write a book on human nature in Jewish thought. And I said, yeah, I could do that, but there are lots of books like that out there. Judaism has an ancient, huge, rich literature, the ground floor of which is the Bible, which is itself unspeakably rich. And there's all kinds of things you could say about what it is to be human, what it is to be mortal, what it is to fall in love, what it is to get sick, to be vulnerable, to be responsible, to aspire to spiritual heights, to constantly fall into the depths of moral depravity. Judaism has lots to say about all of those things. But I didn't feel that really addressed our contemporary problem. Our contemporary problem, from the point of view of what a religious tradition has to teach about what it is to be human, is that the elite discourse of our time, the discourse of science, has no place for what religious traditions have to say about being human. Let me give you a quote from the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, Francis Crick. He wrote a book in the 1990s called The Astonishing Hypothesis. The book was about the material, that is to say, the neural brain basis of consciousness. So here's Crick. You, your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are, in fact, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules, end quote. So this is a good example of what one philosopher calls nothing buttery. X is nothing but Y. So we are nothing but our brains. Our brains are a 3-pound batch of stuff located in our bodies, part of our bodies, our sense of self, our memories, our feeling of who we are as unique individuals is just a kind of narrative that the left hemisphere of our brain tells the right hemisphere in order to allow us to adapt and survive in the most optimal fashion. There's no foothold in this picture for something like a soul. That seems like an incredible idea that has no traction in the material world. That's out. How can we square that picture from neuroscience with our own sense of who we are? So that's the basic problem of the book. How do you solve that problem? Well, you could take a kind of fundamentalist religious stance and say, well, the science is just, foolish or depraved or off the mark or a lesser truth or something like that, and you could dogmatically assert a religious truth as a sort of higher insight into the nature of the human. A lot of people do that. So what are we on that purely religious, non-scientific account? What the religions, and Judaism as well, has been saying for at least a couple of thousand years, we are souls. Ultimately, we have these bodies, sure, but ultimately that's not what we are. Ultimately, we're this sort of unique spiritual visitor who occupies that body for some period of time. In some ways, our identity, our uniqueness, it's from before we were embodied, and it will survive after the demise of our body. So as I say, this is common to the Western religions and to some extent the Eastern religions. It's certainly common to Judaism. Or certainly, I should say, very pervasive in Judaism. So every day when a traditional Jew wakes up in the morning, that person says this little Hebrew prayer, Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam shehechazarta bi nishmati b'chemla rabba munatecha. It means, I am grateful to you, living and existing King, God, that you have returned to me my soul with mercy. Great is your faithfulness. And then a moment later, you make some assertions about the nature of this soul. So here's what subsequent prayer says. It says, God, the soul that you have placed within me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me, and you guard it inside me. And in the future, you will take it from me and give it back to me in a future yet to come. All the time that the soul is within me, I'm thankful to you, Master of the universe, God of all souls. Blessed are you who returns souls to dead limbs. All right, so I think that's a pretty strong assertion of what it is that makes us uniquely ourselves. It's this spiritual entity. Now, how can you believe that in an age of neuroscience? That's, in a sense, the problem of the book. Can one be a Jew, or I would say a Christian or Muslim, Hindu in good faith, and have a higher understanding of what we most essentially are, and yet be fully on board with what the best contemporary science tells us? So that's the book I wanted to write, rather than just a collection of Jewish sayings about human nature, and I think that's the book I did write. So let me just get a little bit into the issues. I teach a semester-long 15-week class on this, so as you can imagine, I could keep you here for a very long time, and happily you wouldn't stand for it. So I'm going to be as quick and to the point as I can. In Western thought, there have been basically two big traditions about human nature and the role of some sort of spiritual dimension, call it a soul, in the forming of that human nature. The first tradition, which is very much with us in the religions, like the religious texts that I just read, Judaism, is from Plato. Plato's view is that the soul is a fully living creature. It's a spiritual entity, which is the essence of ourselves. It's our I, our ego, our identity, our memory. And it is independent of the body, but it gets joined to the body when conception takes place. And when death occurs, it's separated from the body and it goes its way. Rabbi Rahim was telling me that his daughter is taking a course at University of Vermont on Plato's Apology, which is Socrates' defense of himself before his death. And at the end of the Apology, his disciples say, Socrates, where shall we bury you? And he says, anywhere you want if you can catch me. I mean, that really sums it up. His view is that the essence of what he is this spiritual, immaterial psyche, the soul that goes away. That has a huge impact on subsequent religion in the West. And that's sort of the orthodox view of what it is that makes us human, that separates us from the animals, that makes us not just a social primate with a big brain at the end, for the time being, of a very lengthy evolutionary process. Not all that different from our simian cousins like chimps and bonobos, except we can do bigger calculations and we have this interesting thing called language. But if you can't hold to that sort of old-fashioned soul view as the essence of our human nature, and neuroscience today won't let you hold that view. And we live in an age of neuroscience. If you read the New York Times, you notice that they have a column every week called Gray Matter. It's about neuroscience and the latest news from neuroscience about our personalities, our memories, our desires, our antagonisms. Everything gets traced to the brain. We've all seen those gorgeous photos of functional magnetic, the fMRIs, right, where different parts of your brain light up. If you're listening to a foreign language, this part lights up. If you're listening to your own language, that part lights up. If you're afraid of something, another part lights up. If you get worried, something else begins to. So more and more and more, we're understanding that our consciousness, everything that makes us us, seems to come from the collections of trillions of synapses that the billions and billions of nerve cells in our brain can produce. There's no room in that picture for anything like a soul. So where do we turn to if we want an alternative? Well, the alternative is also there in ancient Greece in Plato's student, Aristotle. Aristotle has a very different view of the soul. He rejects the Platonic idea that the soul is some sort of ghostly being that comes into this animal machine. Aristotle's view is what soul means, that is, what the essence of a being is, whether that being is you or me, or whether that being is my pet guinea pig, or whether that being is an organ like the eye. Aristotle says if the eye were a being, sight would be its soul. That's interesting. It means that when something is properly organized and functioning in a normal way, functioning well, doing what it's supposed to be doing, that well-functioning living organization is its soul. What does that mean? It means that soul is not something separate from the outside that comes in, a la Plato. Soul emerges, it grows out of our physicality. Soul is the language that we use to speak about holism, about the entirety of what we are, as beings of mind, as beings of body. You can't have one without the other. And once the entirety of that organization, of that integration, of that well-functioning living whole is gone, once you have disintegration, you stop talking about the soul. That's the Aristotelian view. And that also gets picked up into Judaism and Christianity, and there's a lot of talk about this today. The fancy term for this is emergence. I'm going to say a couple of things about emergence, and with that I'm going to wind down and invite questions and tell you a little story from the Talmud as well. So this view that we call emergence is that out of simple things, more complicated things develop. And out of those more complicated things, yet more complicated things develop. And at every stage of this development, there's kind of a new ground floor, a new threshold, and you can't explain the more complicated developments from the simpler components. Psychologists call this a gestalt. Let me give you a few examples. One of the things I used to do is paint and draw. And in fact, you can see a drawing of mine on the wall down there here in the Damany gallery. It's a drawing from about, 45 years ago of my hands. I was holding hands up and I was sketching them, so hands-on healing, that was. Now, what is that? It's a bunch of graphite marks on paper, which is a bunch of molecules. I always tell people in my class that they'd better turn their phones off. So, physician, heal thyself, as the New Testament says. So you can look at that in terms of much simpler components, right? You can look at a painting as blotches of color rather than a landscape or a still life or a face. And you can look at those blotches of color as vast collections of colorless molecules. You can go down as far as you can go down to quantum fields. And you can say, yeah, okay, from a certain point of view, that painting, that sketch is nothing but those quantum fields. That's it. But while there's some truth in that, that is in a way what it's made up of, there's some falsehood in that too. Because as these properties have emerged, they become something that's not an illusion. They become something like a sketch, like a painting, like music for that matter. There's no music in nature. You know, there's pitched vibrations. There are no melodies. There are no harmonies. These are things we perceive, and we perceive them because we've put them into nature in a sense, because we react to what's there. So that's the case that Aristotle begins to make for so-called emergence. And it's the case that people who try to pursue this path of finding in consciousness, or as I would say in the soul, something that goes beyond its purely material basis and yet is real, has its own reality. So I see some people kind of shaking their heads, no, they don't believe me. Let me give you, I think, an uncontroversial example of emergence. This is a piece of paper with ink on it. But it's something else, right? It's a $5 bill. It allows you to do things in the world that any piece of paper with ink on it doesn't allow you to do. It doesn't allow you to do too much these days, but you get the point. It is what we call a social reality. It is a socially constructed reality, as is the language that I'm using, you're hearing and comprehending. These are not simple products of nature. but they're part of the co-evolved cultural world in which human beings as natural creatures adapt and survive. They're real in a sense. They're real in a very real sense. Not in the same sense that a potato or Mount Everest is real, but they're real nonetheless in the way that music is real and art is real. And even within nature, forests are real. A forest, to use a pure Aristotelian example, is more than the sum of the flora that makes it up. A forest is not just a collection of X numbers of trees, of Y numbers of ferns, and so on and so forth. A forest becomes a kind of living whole. How do you know that? Because what the forest as a whole does is cause changes to itself. That is, once you have a leafy canopy, what gets to grow on the ground changes. It's not the same. So this is, for the philosopher, the sure mark of something real, when it gets to cause something else. And the fact that I get to cause things like language, like raising my hand when I want to, that gives a kind of emergent reality to who I am. So that's the basic case I try to make out in the book. And what I want to argue, and I think it's a good argument, and I resolutely refuse to agree with anyone who disagrees with it. No, I'd be happy to be pushed. But I think once you show that persons have a real status in the world and can't be boiled down to what Francis Crick wants to boil us down to, assemblies of molecules. Once you get to that point, then you have a way of talking that's open to religious specifications, colorations, discourse about what a person is. So that's what the book does. It makes a philosophical argument for what the reality of human nature is, human personhood, and then it says this is a rich Jewish view of what that looks like. And I go on to tell many, many, many Jewish stories. So let me close with one of them. There's a lovely genre in ancient Jewish literature called the Talmud of philosophical dialogues between rabbis and Romans. The Romans pose these very philosophical questions to the rabbis. So here's a Roman named Antoninus. He asks Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he says, he challenges, I'll just read from the book, he challenges the rabbi with the thought that soul and body can each free themselves from judgment. The body can plead that it cannot be guilty of sin because as soon as the soul leaves it, it is inert as a stone. Thus, any wrongdoing must be the soul's fault. The soul can plead that once it leaves the body, it flies about like a bird, unconnected with the material world in which wrongdoing occurs. They can each blame the other. So the philosopher buys this fully Platonic picture of strong soul-body distinction, and he wants to say you can't really have a functioning human person who has moral responsibility in this way. So doesn't that give us a kind of conundrum? The rabbi is going to buy into the soul-body kind of distinction, but he's also going to qualify it and I think get at a more holistic view, which is, I think, the sound view, the view that I'm advocating for. The rabbi responds with a parable. Consider a king who has a wonderful orchard in which there are delightful figs. He appoints 2 watchmen, one lame and the other blind, to guard the figs. The lame man is entranced by the figs and tells the blind man how attractive they are. They combine forces, the lame man getting onto the blind man's shoulders and navigating him to the fig trees. When the owner of the garden returns and discovers that his figs have been eaten, he interrogates the 2 men. The lame man feigns ignorance, saying that he has no feet with which to walk. The blind man makes a similar excuse. The king then resolves to place the lame man on top of the blind one and judge them together. Hence, God, at the time of judgment, will put the soul back into the body and judge them as a composite whole. Okay. So in a way, this parable accepts the dualism, the Platonic separation view, but also qualifies it. And it says that to have any sense of human personhood in which responsibility and agency and action loom very large, there has to be a holistic integration. That's very much the Bible's view, by the way. The Bible doesn't have a sense of soul, it has a sense of animated flesh. That you have a human being and God breathes a breath into that being, and then there's animation, and that's what human nature is. It's that animated flesh. But there's no sense in there that there's something uniquely essential that will be rejoined with you after death or anything like that. So I think religious traditions, if mine is any indication, do have very rich resources that allow us to look contemporary Darwinism and neuroscience and so on in the face and to say we can get along. So I hope we can get along. Thank you. Do you want? Yeah, okay.
So I have a question about Aristotle. What happens to the soul of an aging person as the body and mind atrophy? Is the soul still there? Is it not there?
It reminds me of a few years ago when my mother was dying of Alzheimer's. Someone said to me, as a philosopher, how does that affect you? Not as a son, but as a philosopher. I said, it's purged me of the last lingering traces of my Platonism. That is, when you see a person in every sense of the word diminishing because of a neurological disease, memory going, selfhood going, all abilities of higher conscious functioning sentience going, how can you not think that all of that is just materially rooted in the brain? I think it vitiates Platonism. Does it vitiate Aristotelianism? No, I don't think so. I think Aristotle would say that just as in his interesting example of if the eye were a creature in its own right, sight would be its soul. If the eye is impaired and it loses its sight, it loses its soul in a sense. So I think Aristotle would be pretty comfortable with soul diminishing correlative with organic diminution. Of course, I've hugely simplified the Aristotelian point of view. He does have, it gets a little messier, but that's to be pursued at another point, I think.
Yes, on my journey in life, I, at a young age, began to realize there was more to life than what was visible. And in that, today, I realize human beings are made up of spirit, body, meaning temple, and soul. And that immersion that you shared is learning how to take better care of yourself in the scientific aspect, and also what I understand is soul is mind, will, and emotions, and that immersion process, as you understand how intricately, fearfully, and wonderfully we're made, is that awareness at how to take care of the body. But because of my faith, the body belongs to the Creator as well as the spirit, and will eventually decay to nothingness. And this gentleman's question, I learned specifically the brain is the organ to compute the soul, the mind, the will, the emotions, and that the spirit needs to also be fed with truth to make up the best functioning and awareness of the body and journeying then for each human being to seek truth.
I think you touch on some very important themes. I think it's very important, I've tried to convey, to resist a purely materialistic Francis Crick type interpretation of what it is to be human. I think words like soul and spirit or mind and self are good words, and I don't think we should stop using them. I don't think science, properly interpreted, puts a stop sign up in the middle of the linguistic road saying you can't speak this way anymore. I think you're right to point to hints of transcendence, like truth, like a mindful awareness of reality that's not seen.
Right.
But truth in particular, one of the things I find very troubling in the current kind of atheism, scientism sort of discourse that this book reacts against is this idea that life is valueless, life is meaningless. Any meaning or value that we find is somehow alien to the universe. It's something our peculiar subjectivity just kind of brings in. But it's not there. We're just making it up. And we're making it up for sort of self-interested survivalist reasons. A brain that takes itself seriously has a better chance of surviving in 50,000 years ago, 100,000, 200,000 years ago than not. This whole sort of materialistic discourse, it seems to me to be foolish in the sense that science itself is a truth-seeking enterprise. Science is oriented to value, and value is transcendent. I mean, value outstrips a world of mere material facts. When we engage in a project that seeks to find truth for its own sake, not just because of its practical payoffs in terms of technology, but because of the transcendent value of knowledge in our human lives, I think we are attesting to something higher in us.
Well, why does that have to be defined as God or a spiritual person? Why can't that be the essence of human nature?
Well, I'm not making that claim.
Okay.
Right.
I mean, I think my friend here is making that claim, but I'm not making that claim.
Understanding that part, that why, if even a human being wasn't really presented with that, the spirit part, what in the conception and birth, spirit and soul, then what is already imparted in that spirit, interconsciously in our minds or brain would maybe be subconscious.
Well, I think
So,
where we might part,
it's mysteries.
I think just to close up here, because I know you have someone else coming up, I think where we might part company here is, well, I want to use words like soul and spirit and so on, but I don't think you can draw some sort of mental line or get a string between that word and something in the world that corresponds to it in a simple, straightforward way. Like, I don't think there's a part of our makeup, Plato did, that's a soul or a spirit. I think these are very useful, powerful, important ways of talking about the wholeness of what we are, what we have to do, of the interpersonal world that we live in, and so on. So if you think that's outlandish, consider something very simple, the notion of a right. We can't really have a moral world without rights. We can't have a legal order without rights. What are rights? Can you find them? They're not like rain. They're not like umbrellas. right is an incredibly important concept that gets not just at our moral business with each other, but gets at our dignity. It gets at what it is to respect each other, to respect ourselves, to have standing in a way that acknowledges our worth. But rights don't exist, once again, in the way potatoes or Mount Everest exist. They exist more in the way that $5 bills exist. But their existence is not arbitrary. It's absolutely crucial and central. Now, some people would argue that this is also true for the word God, but that's another talk. Okay.
There you go.
Okay.